we are back. This is Design Deconstructed episode 7, and the next chapter in my content tour, which will be me playing through chapter 3 of Path of Fire, where the chapter is called Night of Fires. This chapter has both an open world component and an instant mission. I was responsible for creating both, but in the interest of time, and because we are currently getting our roof replaced, and at any moment we could have guys upstairs banging and hammering, so I'm going to try to keep this one a little bit short. And there isn't really much I can say about the open world steps. They were designed to promote players going out and exploring the world just beyond Amnoon, and they operated somewhat independently from the open world content that was around, but they also couldn't get in the way of events, but they could piggyback on events. And so there's a couple of instances where they take you out to areas where some of the forged sort of roving band events take place to get you out to experience those pieces of content. Other than that, I wanted to keep them really standard and pretty simple. I didn't want to have a whole lot of overhead. So there's one where you go to a camp in the north and you use explosives and your skills to take out some forged cannons. And then in the east, there's another camp where you go in and you look for some intelligence on the forged, and you learn a little bit about them. And there's not much to it. They're pretty light in terms of content. So I didn't want to spend a lot of time playing through those. So we're going to just skip that stuff and move into the instance part of the content. Now those pieces of open world content also set up the narrative context for what the instance was going to be about, which is specifically we're establishing that the commander is a tactical thinker. So you're taking out forged camps surrounding Amnoon, both because they are a continued threat to you, in terms of they could flank behind you if you're in the middle of attacking the main camp, and then also they're a threat to Amnoon, and we obviously are here to not just chase Balthazar, but to stabilize the region a little bit while we're here. But we're also going to gather some intelligence on the enemy, because we're still evaluating the Forge. They are a new threat to the commander at this point in the story, so they have some things that we want to learn about them. From a high-level standpoint, the instance was something that I wanted to do to pay homage to some of the Guild Wars 1 style missions because of its size, and this is really the first piece of content that I worked on where I was able to utilize the new checkpoint technique that we had developed, where you could sort of, bookmark your place in the story at certain points. And so because I had the access to that tech, I was able to kind of push the difficulty on this a little bit towards more of a Guild Wars 1 level. So I crammed it full of enemies to sell that this is Balthazar's main camp in the region. This is his, for lack of a better word, HQ. And Guild Wars 1 missions were always fairly dense combat encounters. There was a lot of enemies in Guild Wars 1 missions. Probably skewed towards too much, if I'm being honest. I think a lot of Guild Wars 1 missions ended up feeling a bit too much like a slog. And I think there's a balance there between that level of combat and what we have in Guild Wars 2 typically. So I wanted to find that balance and try to make this feel a little bit more nostalgic, like it was something where you had a lot of enemies and you had to vanquish them all. I think the only thing I missed out on including in this to truly pay homage to the Guild Wars 1 was to have there be a hard mode. I didn't want to do that and make it too difficult. So it ended up being, I think, a pretty good balance between Guild Wars 1 style and Guild Wars 2 style for combat. This chapter is also one where I somehow got a chance to have a bunch of my pre-written dialogue actually make it through to ship. Usually the process for us on Guild Wars 2 was that a designer would sort of stub in rough dialogue, basically just saying, hey, here's what goes here. I need the commander to say this here, and then they would pass it off to the writer, and the writer would go in and do their pass and write the script tailored towards that stuff. But In this case, likely because a lot of the spoken dialogue in this chapter ended up being related to the action and the mechanic of the sentries and the guards and stuff like that, and then later the Herald fight. I think a lot of my initial dialogue paths ended up surviving because there was very little need to do a lot of changes to that, because it called out specifically what I needed the player to be saying, what the commander needed to be saying in that moment. So I'm actually proud of this chapter more for that, because I obviously love storytelling and character development, and so being able to write those characters and have that dialogue actually go through, and with only a cursory changes here and there by the writing team to bring it into their standards. I was actually really proud of the fact that a lot of it survived. I will freely admit that gameplay-wise, I'm quite happy with it as well. I think in particular the Herald fight at the end feels like the kind of encounter that I wanted to do, even though it was actually a nightmare for me to script, because that instance actually nearly broke me as a designer in terms of uh, the complexity of that whole sequence at the end where the Herald is going around through the Temple of Cormyr, smashing things. There was a lot of scripting that ended up needing to be done and then redone and then looked at and then reviewed and then reworked. And I even turned it over to another designer at some point. There were some people who were coming off of a Living World episode who could help. And we often do that. We would often do that in Guild Wars 2, where a team that was finishing up before they had other things to work on, they would kind of get put into a position or role to help. We did that after Path of Fire shipped. We went and helped a Living World episode. So that's typical for the way that ArenaNet operated. And so I turned over the Herald fight and that encounter over to another designer. They took a pass at it. They helped refine a lot of the ideas that I had and got into better shape. And then when they were done and had to go back onto their regular projects, I was back on and I was able to take what they had done and what I had done before that, marry the two together, combine them into a whole, and ended up shipping what the both of us had done. So yeah, what we ended up shipping with this chapter, I think hits all the right notes, both narratively and gameplay wise. I'm very proud of it. I think it offers just enough challenge to keep players engaged, and relied heavily on the trust in Guild Wars 2's base combat mechanics, because there's not a lot of tricky mechanics here. It's really just you fighting dudes, the Forged. And so with that, I would say let's just go ahead and jump into the game and play through Night of Fires. All right, here we go. Get rid of that daily chest because I hate those pop-ups. I don't hate them, but I definitely get annoyed. It triggers my OCD. I can't have them hanging around there. Sorry. Right, so here we are at the start of the Night of Fires chapter instance. The first thing I was going to call out for this playthrough was how much I enjoyed working with Canuck and Ritlock. The two of them together have a nice rapport. They're similar characters but different, and that's one of the things I like exploring, is how they have kind of an attitude towards them, both of them, but their attitude manifests in different ways. And I wanted to build the instance kind of around that difference, in the way that Ritlock counsels us to just go in and smash the gate down and kill all the Forged. That's his approach to most problems. Canuck, on the other hand, is like, yeah, we should probably be a little more careful, because we are going to be seriously outnumbered here, and we don't want to bring the house down on us. So he's not counseling stealth so much as tactical approach to combat, which is it's not a direct choice. It's not like you have to choose between one or the other approach. You can sort of on the fly make that choice by how you play. That's one of the things that I wanted to do. In Heart of Thorns, we had more overt choices where you actually make a choice and then you have to sort of play through the consequence of that choice. In this, we wanted to have some choices like that for gameplay, but we didn't want to, sort of hem the player in and be like, well, now you've made this choice, and now you have to live with it. So on this one, I built this sentry mechanic, which we'll see once I get through playing, where you kind of have the option of whether or not you want to just go in guns blazing like Ritlock does, or whether you want to take a more careful approach the way Canuck is counseling. So I had this little moment here where the two of them kind of lay that out for the player. Again, I always like giving players the opportunity to kind of like walk along with NPCs, but in this case, you can also just kind of run ahead. And if you run ahead, Ritlock gets happy because he's like, or Canuck says, might I suggest we pause to discuss the options first? And Ritlock is like, right behind you, Commander. So that's, again, to try to establish that this is player's choice here in how you approach the encounters. There's a really light, thing out here. I didn't put a lot of combat out here specifically because I wanted to make this moment be about, the orders, and I also kind of like the idea that the Forged were kind of confident and arrogant enough that they would like station 2 guards outside. There used to be a roving patrol that you also had to contend with, but I took it out because all it did was step on all the VO, and none of the VO was recorded with the idea that you were fighting in the middle of that. So we had been trying before I left, to make the VO sound appropriate to what the player was doing. So if the player was involved and engaged in combat, the VO is supposed to reflect that with, like, them having a bit more exertion in the way that they say words and stuff like that. And so we were careful that, hey, if we got the VO back and it sounded like there wasn't combat going on in that dialogue, then we wouldn't have combat in that area. Or at least we tried to do that as much as possible. Yeah. So yeah, there was a shortcut put in there so that players could, and then this was a pure concession to the fact that we have mounts now, and players can absolutely just kind of roll right through all our tripwires in 2 seconds and trigger everything. So let's talk a minute about the sentry mechanic. I already kind of triggered it, but while we're fighting these Forge, I can go over. The sentry mechanic was one that I wanted to do for a while, and I didn't really have a good opportunity to do it, and I thought this was a perfect time to sort of introduce it. We had done some stealth mechanics in previous chapters. I will admit, although I appreciate the effort that went into trying to add stealth into our game, I've never really been a fan of it, only because stealth in our game seems so, I don't know, it seems so artificial because we literally have spells that turn you invisible, and there's lots of that. There's lots of cloaking and stealth, and so like there isn't really a mechanic there, right? It's just you're invisible and people can't see you, presumably. So it's kind of tough. So I wanted to have something that was, hey, if you're going to do tactical combat, how would you do it? Well, alarms. It's sort of the Metal Gear Solid, I guess, approach to it's more like stealth action, where that sentry who was standing here had a marker over his head that was a closed eye. When he spots you, he gets the eye open on his top of his head, and he runs for the brazier over here. And if he gets to it, he does a little crafting emote, and he sends up a flare and calls down everybody that's within line of sight of this object. And so that was my way of sort of like creating a tense situation where you would have to take the sentries out before they could raise the alarm if you were going to play this stealthily. If you wanted to do the Britlock approach, you wouldn't care about the sentry. You could just ignore him, let him call all of his buddies, and just take on the entire camp at once, or at least large chunks of the camp at once. Although that changed by the time we shipped. It used to be the case that brazier would call down everybody within line of sight. I'm wrong about that. What we ended up shipping was a different version uh, where these platforms over here would spawn a group of reinforcements who would then come and you would have to take them on in addition to anyone else you were fighting. So it was an add-on level of difficulty. It wasn't, what we found was that calling significant portions of the camp down on your head was too difficult. It threw the balance off quite a bit. And it also made some of the stuff that we were trying to do here sort of, I don't know, faster than we wanted it to be, I guess would be the way I would describe it, because you could literally, like if I'd called down everyone in this section of the camp, you would kill them all here if you survived and didn't get killed. And then you would have no other combat for the rest of the instance. And so that kind of felt like it was breaking the pacing for this content. So I backed off from that. I'm going to critique my own stuff here because that's part of why I'm doing this. I think the sentry mechanic didn't work ultimately. I think it works functionally, and I think it works in principle, but in practice, I think that it ended up being too easy. I think it was too easy to get the sentries before they got to the braziers to call reinforcements. So I think, I mean, I could be wrong. It could be that I'm biased because I played this content so many times that I just know how to win. And so it's possible that that is coloring my approach to this. But it feels like, I mean, like here is a good case where maybe this sentry could actually get to the brazier in time and send up an alarm. I'm not sure. So yeah, maybe it's not as easy as I think it is, but I felt it was too easy. In part because once he gets to the brazier, he has to do a complicated animation sequence in order to trigger the thing, and that animation sequence gets interrupted with combat. And so every time as long as you're attacking him, he will never send up the flare and call the reinforcements down on your head. So that's why I kind of think it ended up feeling too easy for me. I think the other thing that was sort of a bad maybe design choice on my part, or maybe I just didn't do well enough to frame it and working with narrative enough to get this across, is that a lot of people who played this content took it to be, oh, I'm having to choose between stealth and brute force. And that's not the choice, right? As I mentioned, I wasn't trying to go for a stealth approach here. I was trying to go more for tactical versus non-tactical combat. So I don't think that came across because everybody that I had experienced this content and played through it with me made comments to the effect of, well, why can't I stealth my way through this? And it's like, well, because it's not a choice. Kanak is not suggesting that we stealth our way through. He's suggesting that we just be cautious. And again, this goes back to what I said at the intro, that this is an homage to Guild Wars 1. And one of the things you had to do in a lot of Guild Wars 1 missions was a technique called kiting, where you would, we don't have it here in this version of the game, but in Guild Wars 1 you had a white bubble around your character, and anything that was inside that bubble was aware of you. And it was, it was a technique that you would be able to, creep up on enemies, get them in your bubble, and then pull them back, right? And then pull them back and pull them back until you could take on small groups of enemies, 2 or 3 at a time, and not be overwhelmed with the entire, map worth of bad guys. So, yeah, I think this works. I think it's not not as refined as I had wanted it to be in the end. And that's totally on me. Yeah. I did a bunch of fakery here with AI. One of the things that I had mentioned in previous episodes was that we had a new AI system, and the Forge were using it, but I didn't get exactly the results that I wanted from it. And so here what I did was I turned off their AI and I faked a different sort of AI that was more in line with the sentry mechanic and the gameplay that I was going for. So what I did is I put down a bunch of sphere tripwires throughout this entire mission, and I just ran constant checks against who was in which tripwire and whether or not they were part of a line of sight. And so that way, what I was able to have very fine control over, which the AI didn't necessarily give me, or if it did, it was really hard to debug. Because I've mentioned before, the AI is great, it's really powerful, but it's really hard to understand the debugger on it, because there's so many moving parts and so many possible decisions that an AI can be making at any one time, that understanding why they're not doing exactly what you want them to do can be really a problematic thing. It was for me. Maybe other more technical designers would have had an easier time of this, using the AI for this, but I struggled with it. So I ended up falling back on what I know, which is scripting. And so I scripted these guys to just basically be able to tell each other, hey, I'm in tripwire 22. All right, cool. I'm in tripwire 22 as well. So then if I'm attacked while I'm in tripwire 22, any enemies that are in tripwire 22 get signaled that, hey, my buddy's being attacked. And yeah, it's a very brute force approach to encounter design, but that's, again, what I was comfortable doing. Because, again, it gave me very incredible control over exactly where I wanted enemies to be and how often, groups would aggro on each other, and to call, each other for assistance. I'm going to talk a little bit about these strange burning scrolls. This was, as I had mentioned, I think in a previous episode, in the previous episode I talked about the Herald of Balthazar being Devona, which was a character from Guild Wars 1. These strange burning scrolls were clues to her identity. Each of them had little snippets of her history and her personality, which hopefully came through. I think a couple of people figured it out before we made an official announcement. I mean, I'd wanted that to be the case. There was certainly a talk about whether or not we would want to spoil that, or whether let players continue to speculate on it. I was curious to know if we'd given enough clues to her identity to make the connection, and I think we did. I think it was, not an easy thing to figure out for players who were not steeped in the deep Guild Wars lore, but yeah, that's what we ended up doing, and I think it was pretty successful, given that we did have somebody on Reddit, I think was the first person to discover or posit the idea that Devona was the Herald. This section was tricky. I had a cinematic here, and I had a cinematic here because the minute you enter this area and Canuck brings this gate down, you get this forged officer's clue. But I never felt comfortable with that because I thought, well, how do you even know that there are forged officers in this camp without seeing them? Because we're moving uphill. We're not looking down at the camp from a high vantage point, which was my initial assumption, was that we were going to get a high vantage point. Really, we're going to be like up here and then have a path down to take on the rest of the camp. That didn't end up materializing for a lot of reasons. One is that there's an event that also takes place in this camp that had specific requirements on it, and so it was impossible for the map artist to juggle conflicting needs from different content design requests. So we ended up with what we had, and so I put a cinematic here to sort of show off the camp ahead of time, because I'd done that a bunch in Hard Thorns, as you had seen through my playthroughs there. Mo hated it. He was very much in favor of taking every cinematic that we possibly could out of the game, and I think we ended up shipping Path of Fire with like less than 5 altogether because of that. I don't necessarily agree with that design choice. I understand that design choice. It's not the choice I would have made personally, because I think the cinematics can help frame action and set up gameplay, but he's the game director, and he made that call, and that's his call to make. So we ended up shipping without this cinematic. And so what I ended up doing is I spawned a veteran officer in here in the middle of the thing so that while you were trapped in here before Canuck brings down the inner gate, you've gone through the sort of outer gate into the main camp. And so I put an officer here and then had the writing folks write me a line that was like, oh, hey, we just killed an officer. Maybe there's other officers inside. Let's go find out. And it's not the most elegant approach to solving that problem, but yeah, it is what it is. I'm gonna go let that sentry go. I don't necessarily care about being perfect on this run through because I kind of like the idea of seeing how the reinforcements will show up. I kept these explosives here. This is an inconsistency that I want to take back, but I don't have the opportunity. They were not called explosives in the open world. I think they were called forged ammunition in the open world, but they're the same thing. And I added them here because I've mentioned before in previous episodes of this series, I don't like introducing a mechanic and then just having it be a one-off. So I wanted to have these forged ammunition piles spread out throughout this chapter so that it feels like, hey, this thing that I picked up in the open world that I learned knocks forged back and does a fair amount of damage to them is something that I continue to use here. So yeah, here now we're dealing with reinforcements, which these are the ones who are called because we let that sentry get to the thing. And yeah, there are more of them than I remember. So maybe the sentry mechanic isn't as hard as isn't as easy as I framed it to be. But yeah. Anyway, following through on this discussion, I kind of wish that I had put some cannons in here to harass the player, because that would have been a more sort of direct tie to the open world portion of this chapter. If there were some cannons here that were firing at you and you had to use these to take them out. Yeah, that's one of those where hindsight is 20/20. I do love that you can throw these bombs on Forged and basically one-shot them and knock them flying. I don't know. I'm a big fan of giving players limited opportunities to feel super overpowered. I know that balance is a tricky thing, and you don't want players to feel like they are like super amazingly powerful all the time, because you want challenge in your content. But I think there's a middle ground there, where sometimes it's okay to give players like super awesome powers, and throwing a big cannonball on top of a guy. I don't care how many armor points he has. I think it's going to kill him. So I was in favor of that, And the trick was just to spread them out enough and make them. Oh, I missed the opportunity on that one. Make them not spawn so quickly that you can just make a run through with just throwing the explosives on them. But yeah, that's just more of a balance thing. Yeah, there's an achievement here to vanquish all these guys. You don't have to. If you take out all the officers, the rest of these guys will retreat, make a tactical retreat, and head to the central pillars here that have like flame portals. Although I don't think we ended up getting the effects for this, did we? No, we did not. There was supposed to be flame portals on each of these that was very clear that, oh, this is where reinforcements come from. If you get the sentries alerted, and where those guys will retreat to when they leave. I think that may have been because the open world didn't want to have those be portals. I think they serve a different purpose in the open world, and so we kind of compromised on it and didn't get the effect that I requested. Yeah, so this was one of these cases where I made a late decision to have these officers, these four sort of unique, distinct officers. I didn't have the bandwidth to get new creatures because the forged army was already pretty full up. So what I ended up doing is I got creative. I made 4 unique composites, and I just created specific dudes using. I mixed and matched the pieces that we had for some of the forged, and I created 4 unique looking forged. They're not so unique because again they're using a variety of parts and pieces that we had from other forged enemies, but they're distinct enough for my purposes here. So I ended up getting. I don't think they ended up getting specific skills either. I think. Well, that's not true. I did give them slightly different skills. They all had a base pool to work from, but then I think the way I made it was I removed 1 skill from each of them so that each of them had 3 of the 4, and it was a different 3 of the 4 for each one. So that way, again, not terribly unique, but unique enough that, hey, this one, does the flame dash, this one doesn't, and the other 3 don't, kind of thing. Sometimes you got to get cheap. And this chapter already had the design encounter, which we're going to encounter when we get completing the objective to get rid of these forged officers. I think getting the timing for the VO and the narrative in here just right was also a tricky thing because there's so many fights, and as I mentioned before, we try to get the VO. None of the VO here was recorded as if the player was in combat, with the exception of the sentry stuff. Yeah, so it was tough. Lots of tripwires placed in very, very specific locations with very specific radii to make sure that you hit them at just the right angle at just the right moment to get some of the dialogue. I can't say it's perfect. I'm sure that there's cases, again, with players being on mounts and being able to travel at different speeds now, it's impossible to know like where the player is going to be at any one time or at what pace they're going to cross into an area. You can only try to do your best to account for most cases and don't worry so much about the edge cases. Other than to have a fallback plan, which is usually, cutting off a dialogue and just ending it prematurely, which I never like to do, but that's, one of the things you kind of have to do with some of these things. I definitely tried to make the inner camp feel like a much more challenging encounter than the outer camp. The outer camp is a little bit more of kiting, and this is a little bit more of the rootlock approach because it's a lot harder to kite these guys because of the space, the way that they're spread out is there's fewer tripwires that are larger, so they have a little bit more sort of awareness, which was my way of, again, faking that, hey, these guys are a little bit better. The inner camp is defended by more elite guard. They're led by 4 officers, so they're going to be a bit more intense than the inner guard, rather. I don't know how well that comes across. I notice it because I did this work. I don't know that any players who played through it would have that feeling. Hopefully some of you picked up on that. I also wanted to make this area feel darker. There's an undertone here. It's pretty subtle, but there are some cages back here, flame cages where they're keeping prisoners, which is also a direct setup for what happens in the open world. In the open world, I think the event that happens out here is that in the middle of this area, they are taking prisoners and basically forging them. They're absorbing their souls and bonding their souls into the metal armor that makes it forged. And so I wanted to make sure to reinforce that with having those cages. And I think there's a clue about the Herald in one of those cages that talks more about like what they're doing and why they're doing it. And they definitely see the Forged see themselves as liberators. They believe that they're liberating Tyria from the dragon's influence, and that this is a holy war because Balthazar is their god. The Forged, it's interesting. I want to talk a little bit about the psychology of the Forged because there was a lot of talk internally about whether Forged had free will or whether they were maybe sort of brainwashed by Balthazar. And I think it's a combination, actually. I don't think there's any one answer to that. I think that there are so the Forged are basically spirits that have been, for lack of a better word, bonded into these metal armor sort of carapaces. Um, and so they're kind of an unstoppable force because they don't feel pain. They're not physical. They're just armor, and so you just have to bash the armor until it gets destroyed. And oh, sorry, I totally didn't see that the Bastion had spawned. I'm not paying attention. Sorry. So yeah, I'll talk about the Bastion in a second. Anyway, the Forged ended up being this sort of seemingly mindless force, but I tend to think that that's a oversimplification. I think that really what it is that the Forged are a combination of spirits who have served Balthazar for generations in some cases. People who go back to the beginning of the gods. When the gods arrived, some of the first humans on Tyria who died and worshipped Balthazar in life would go to the Mists and potentially have served Balthazar in death in his eternal war with his brother. And so I think that there are definitely a mix in the Forged of true believers, those who are absolutely 100% convinced that Balthazar can do no wrong and believe strongly in his mission. And then there are those who, are sort of cafeteria, Tyrians, cafeteria, they might go to service on Sunday to to talk to their gods, but they might not be like hugely devout rather in their worship, and they might agree that it's probably a good thing for me to serve Balthazar in the afterlife, and so I will go do that. But they might question everything too, and so I think that there are Forged who are who have less free will than others, I'll say. I don't know that they all have it stripped away. I think in Devona's case, that was our sort of that was our way of characterizing that. Was Devona had been a very devout follower of Balthazar, and so she was a bit of a true believer. And even though she had been a hero in life and was now being asked to do not heroic things in her afterlife, or at least as a Forged, I think she justified it by saying, "Well, but this is for the greater good, right? Like this is what my God has commanded me to do. I am not one to question my God because I've followed him my whole life and even into the afterlife, and I've never been let down before. So why would I start questioning now?" And it's not until the next chapter when you finally defeat her and you sort of show her that there is another way, and that her God may not be as infallible or as unstoppable as she believes him to be, that she starts to question and starts to doubt. And in her final moments, she's sort of like, wow, okay, maybe I need to revisit that. But we'll talk about that in more depth in the next chapter, because that's where we deal with that. So for now, while I'm talking about the Bastion, while I'm fighting the Bastion, I'll talk about him. This was a design encounter that was added kind of late in the process. We knew we wanted to have this this enemy type introduced in the story because you could have seen it in the open world, but there wasn't any place for us to have this specific model and this specific enemy type in a story chapter. So we wanted to put him here. And he initially starts out just kind of doing his basic attacks that he has, but we just weren't quite happy with everything that he could do out here, because we wanted him to be kind of tanky as well. He's sort of the mid-boss of this chapter, and we wanted this chapter to be kind of on the slightly more difficult side, and it's one of the longer chapters, I think, in the expansion. And so it had a checkpoint in the middle of it. So once we defeat the bastion here, it sort of saves our progress, and we can go on and do the Herald fight as a separate instance. Anyway, so now he's reached his health threshold, and he goes up onto the middle platform here, and so this is what we added to kind of make him differentiated. Is he starts doing this we call the bullet hell attack. No, he's going to start doing it, right? I hope. Yeah, there you go. So this was based on one of the things that we got for Path of Fire, thanks to raids and the guys who are really focused on sort of combat design. They had started doing a lot of this sort of prototypey, like hugely math-intensive sort of skill design. And it was something that we had never used really in story, and it was like, well, we got to have this. This is really awesome. Benjamin Arnold, who I'm sure if you're a fan of Guild Wars 2, you'll recognize the name. He was one of the raids designers, and one of the more sort of, I would say, genius level designers that we had on the team. He just constantly came up with these incredible things that I think the general design sort of group probably had never even thought to do, or if we thought to do, we sort of made the assumption that the engine or the tool wouldn't have allowed us to do it, and he always found a way to do it, and so he had come up with this the ability to do this sort of attack. He didn't do this actual skill implementation. I believe that was either Cameron or John Jaranowski or Taylor Sutherland. All three of those guys had come off of a Living World episode and had volunteered to help us out with some content design, skill design stuff. And so I can't remember which of the three of them ended up working on this chapter specifically. I think it may have been John. Did an amazing job of implementing this and taking this boss fight from 7, which is where I had been able to take it, to an 11. I think I love everything about the way that this ended up working. It definitely makes the last part of this fight feel really frantic. As you saw, I already went down once. I'm not paying attention, but at the same time, even if I wasn't talking and recording this episode, I'm sure I'd probably have died at least once. I think it's a really satisfying and sort of challenge-inducing moment in this chapter. So,
You can tell him
all right.
that in person, Tribune, but we've got to find him first.
So now we've taken this guy out, and we have the checkpoint. So this will save our progress, and now it's up to us to head on over to the after we get the skinny from Ritlock and Canuck, we're going to go meet up with Casimir and decide what the next move should be. And thankfully, the Temple of Cormyr, where we know she is hanging out, is right up the hill. So this gate opens because we're done in this area. This is one of those areas where I'm encouraging players to get on their mount because there's a bit of a run. There's a neat little moment that the writers added here between Ritlock and Canuck, where we get a little story that I would love to hear more of about Ritlock's experience in human temples. In terms of Ritlock saying, "Don't spit on the floor." I want to know where he found that out, because that sounds like a really funny story. All right, so we come in here. I'm going to dismount. Casimir is in here praying. I want to call this out in terms of. It took a little work to get this moment right, because there was a couple of things that were working against us. One is, you know, how respectful we wanted to be towards the religion in the world. As an atheist, I was probably not the best source of information or guidance on this moment, because I was like, well, you just walk in and she's, you know, like whatever, like you interrupt her prayer, like it doesn't matter. And there were other people on the team who voiced concerns that, you know, look, this is a sacred moment for her. Like, so I think we massaged this moment in VO to make sure that it felt tonally correct. I think what we ended up was pretty good. Uh, yeah. Um, I mean, we do apologize as the commander, but then also just getting the movement correct. You know, having her kneel and get up at a very particular point, which was in the middle of a line. So I don't know. One of the technical constrictions that we have is that we can sort of trigger things to happen with characters, but we can't do it on a line by line basis. And in particular, that's hard enough. But in this case, we needed her to get up from her knees where she was praying in the middle of a line, because we needed her to get up when she says, "Oh, I didn't see you enter." Like, that's all one line. Now, we could have broken that up into two lines and potentially made the end of one dialogue be, "Cormier, I ask that you guide me through this difficult." But there's just such a like immediacy to, "Oh, I didn't see you enter," that it never really worked. I tried doing it that way and it just couldn't. And so I ended up doing some shenanigans behind the scenes. I think there's an invisible timer that's counting off. So this is not a great solution, because what I'm doing is I'm timing it off of English. So I'm timing her getting up from her knees on the English line, and it may not work well in German, where the line is probably longer, and the way that grammar works in other languages is not always the same. So I don't know. This is one of those things where I think you have to just kind of hit what you can hit, and I can't time it for every language, because that would have been crazy, and I wouldn't have been able to do a check to see what language you're playing in, because you can change it on the fly too. So, like, yeah. Anyway, all right, we're heading off to meet Keto. Before we go talk to him, though, in detail, I wanted to talk about Keto. Because I'm particularly proud of Keto in some respects and disappointed in others. Keto is my character. I created the character. I wrote his backstory. I actually had to make a specific request of narrative to be able to do that, because that's usually their domain. And as a content designer, you know, obviously I have strong interest in narrative design. I consider myself a narrative designer, but in the world of ArenaNet, narrative design is a very particular skill set, and it does not necessarily involve the implementation side, which is what I was doing. So in order to do a character sort of breakdown like this, I wanted to make sure that I had approval to do it. So I talked to Scott McGough, who is our narrative lead. He was totally on board with it, let me run with it. You know, he saw it as a growth moment for me to bolster my career and get me a skill that I didn't have. So he worked with me on it, which was really awesome. And so I wrote a great backstory for Keto, which I don't know if we will ever go into, if the team will ever go into that in the future. I will tell you what my backstory for him was, and please understand this is not canon. It was never put in the game, so whether or not Keto ends up being this or not, I don't know. That's for the future team to decide. But my story on Keto is that he was an Elonian noble from the south who was in an arranged marriage from his family. He ended up falling in love with the person that he was arranged to be wed to, only to discover on his wedding night that she was an assassin sent to kill him. Once they were wed, it was a ploy by her family to basically get in with that family, have him be killed in a terrorist or assassination attempt, and then she would be tied to the more wealthy family, which was Keto's family, is a very wealthy family. And so it was her family sort of scheming to get in with Keto's family and you know, form a bond of marriage, and then, you know, have this evil plot. What ended up happening is the Order of Shadows found out about it beforehand, stopped the assassination attempt, killed his fiancee before the wedding, and basically then abducted him into their ranks. So he is an Order, in my view, he is an Order of Shadows member who is not really willing to be an Order of Shadows member. He's sort of on the fringe. He is here because he doesn't have much choice. Anyway, that's my backstory for him. I have no idea if the team wants to run with that in the future or not. Take it as you will. I just wanted to put that out there. The thing that I say that where I was disappointed is with his voice actor. I can't say I'm a fan of who they ended up casting. I don't know if there was a miscommunication. I don't believe this is an actor of color. I do believe that this is a white actor playing this role. And I'm not saying that it can't ever be the case that that can work. I don't think it works really well here, in my personal opinion. I think I was picturing Keto a lot more like Chadwick Boseman was sort of my go-to model for him, because I'd just seen him in my gosh, what was the movie? Oh, I'm totally blanking. I'm so sorry. It was a great movie. God, now I'm gonna go to IMDb and figure this out. If I figure it out, if I could think of it before the end of this chapter, ugh, I'm on the spot. No, I can't think of the movie. Oh God, I'm so dumb. Sorry. I will look it up. I will add it to the comments on this video. Anyway, yes, I had just seen Chadwick Boseman. It was not Black Panther, if you're thinking that, because yeah, I think that Path of Fire came out before Black Panther. Anyway, yeah. Sorry, that's gonna distract me now for the rest of this playthrough. I hope. All right, I'm gonna ignore that and move on. The Herald. Yeah, the Herald fight was as I mentioned in the intro. This was not easy. Oh my God, I'm gonna get these guys killed. Oh, I saved them just in time. The mechanic of calling them over. I ended up coming up with a better solution in season 4, chapter 4. Where you have to save the civilians from the Shatterer. I wish they had come up with that here, because this implementation is bad. As you see, I tried to call them over to me, and one of them was caught because they didn't move fast enough, and you don't have control over where they're going, other than they move to your position, which is not a guarantee that they'll get to safety by the time. Yeah, the Herald mechanic here, I tried coming up with a bunch of solutions. There was a version of the Herald encounter that had like a line, like you would like shoot a line of, like, it was supposed to represent your shout, and like that was terrible. Like that was the most gamey version of things that I could possibly think of. I think what ended up shipping here is not, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it's not great, right? Like it does mean that the achievement to save all these people is respectably hard, which I'm okay with, because I do think that that's not a bad thing, that it's hard to save all of the villagers in this area, because I think that is a hard thing to do. When you have an immensely powerful enemy who's smashing large groups of people and setting fires to things, I think it should be suitably hard to save everybody. Again, I know everybody wants to be the best hero that they can be, but being a hero is hard work, and it requires sometimes immense precision and perfect timing, and so I think that that's adequately represented here. But yeah, there is a way to cheat this. If you know where she's going to strike next, you can sort of be in front of her and get to the area where she's going to smash, and have already cleared the enemies or the friendlies out of that area. This also was much shortened from what we ended up initially prototyping for it, because it was such a challenge to do some of the scripting here. I think I ended up having some help, and the help that I had uh, did some of that, sort of bringing it back from where it was, because there was a lot of moving parts here, and I think I probably just got overly ambitious. Um, yeah, and so sometimes it takes an outside point of view to have somebody else come in and take a more dispassionate look at what you're doing and be like, look, why are you making yourself, why are you tearing your own hair out over this? You could simplify this and make it so much better. Anyway, so yeah, you get the priests up. They cast a spell and put out all the fires. Each of them has specific fires they put out. So once this guy gets into position, he'll put out the rest of the fires. I thought that was a neat little moment, showing the priests of Cormyr have, they're not fighters, but they have magic, and they do what they do best, which is, help people and put out fires. Yeah, getting NPCs to help here was also an interesting struggle. For the longest time, Casimir, Canuck, and Ritlock would basically just ignore everything and just stand there while you're trying to help people and trying to get people up, and they just refused for the longest time, and it was a head scratcher. And I ended up finally figuring out it was because they had AI on them. So I removed the AI once more, which is a habit of mine, and voila, everything started working again. So yeah, sometimes AI and improvements in technology can be great, but other times sometimes progress can be kind of challenging. Um, yeah, so that is Night of Fires. I don't know if I have a whole lot more to say on this that I didn't cover. Yeah, I think the tone and everything was good here. I think the help that I had to refine these encounters was a huge benefit, because this is one that, because of its scope and the scale, was taking more of my time than I wanted it to. Oh, there is one thing I'll bring up, which is, there used to be a moment here that was cut, and this is also part of the thing that where I was saying where we simplified. There was a moment where after you met Keto over here, he took you around and he toured through the areas, and I did that because I wanted to, in the same vein of what I did in Heart of Thorns, where I had the Kana take you around the Itzel village and show you all the different areas to, again, sort of familiarize yourself with where the content was going to be and where you needed to position yourself for the gameplay later. I had Keto doing that here too, but I had him going through and not just walking, but he was having you do the same thing that you did in the open world for the Renown Heart, which is making poultices and gathering cloth for bandages and putting together food for the refugees. And you were doing all this sort of like busy work to sort of prepare. And I kind of lost the thread of what I was trying to do, which was just show you the areas. Um, and so we pulled back on that. A, because it was redundant with what you were doing in the open world, and B, because it added bloat to the content, and we didn't need it. And so I ended up taking it out. I don't think it's super relevant to have gone through this space, because this space is a circular area, and the refugees also gather in specific areas away from where Keto was going to tour you, so it didn't really make sense, to keep. So we took it out. Yeah, that's it. I will call it a day, and we will move on and take tomorrow or maybe next week. I'm not sure. We have the roofers coming to our house again later today, so hopefully I can maybe get squeeze in maybe one more episode to record today so that I can get 2 out this week. I don't know. Anyway, that's it for me for now, and I will see you all again for next episode where we'll be talking about the next chapter, which is called The Sacrifice. Until then, like, subscribe, take a visit with my website. I continually added it this week. I updated a couple screenplay samples that I got feedback on, so I'm constantly going to be taking a look at my work there and adding to it and improving it as much as I can. So yeah, hope to see you guys next episode. Thanks.